Hyper puppies bounce inside my head, gnawing on the bone that makes up my skull. They are feral strays rambling my brain, trying to find a home that isn't there. If they could just settle, then I could sleep. Maybe when grown I could tame them. But for now, the animals are in control, and when they bark, I answer.
Wow. Hi, Conor.
How are you? How's things?
I'm good. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for coming on, Conor. I really appreciate it. Just give a brief introduction. Conor joins us from Athlone
That's
in the
correct.
centre of Ireland, the heartland of Ireland. But he got his education here in Galway at NUIG, which is now UG, University of Galway. His education is in biochemistry around the genetics of schizophrenia, and he has a master's in clinical neuroscience around childhood trauma and social cognition. And Conor is now working as a recovery education facilitator, which is mental health workshops for young people, and a peer support worker on MOST trial, which is moderated online social therapy. So, yeah, you seem to have a particular interest, Conor. Just judging by everything you're interested in. Uh, but what we're here to talk about is something else that you started, which is the Psychosis Arts Collective, which is very interesting, I find. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the Psychosis Arts Collective and what it's about, what it's doing?
Absolutely, yeah. So I'll start with, I suppose, the basics. PAC, or the Psychosis Arts Collective, PAC, is a group or a collective of artists who all have a lived experience of psychosis. So each one of us will have a unique experience, but also in a similar way, we have similar experiences and we can share and share insights about what we've been through, and all through the medium of creativity. So I suppose one of the aims is to fight stigma, and that peer connection piece is a huge part of it, that we can relate to each other. And then through that, then we can create art or poetry or videography or playwriting like some of the artists have done. And that normalizes the experience and shows that we have something to offer.
Okay, so for people out there who don't understand or who are curious about it, what is psychosis?
Yeah, so psychosis in its, I suppose, most simple form is a loss of touch with reality. So many people that have psychosis will go through delusions, cognitive distortions, basically. They might have hallucinations, visual or auditory hallucinations, and they also might hear voices as well. Well, that will be auditory hallucinations. Um, and they might also, I suppose, have paranoia. So they might think that someone's out to get them, their family, the government. And then I suppose there's two sides to psychosis in a way, for me anyways, at least. There's the psychotic episode, which is the first interaction I suppose you'd have, which is brings the delusions and the hallucinations and all that side of thing. They're the positive symptoms of psychosis and psychosis related disorders. Then the negative symptoms would be things like, I don't know, social withdrawal, cognitive deficits, social cognition deficits, and basically all the things that come with after your episode, after you've recovered from the psychotic symptoms. People also struggle to reintegrate with society, and that can be an issue as well.
Just to clarify a bit of your language there, positive and negative in the terminology as you're using it does not mean good and bad.
No, they're I suppose they're both bad in a way.
Mm.
They're both difficult experiences. I think the positive and negative is more positively, I suppose, psychotic, I suppose, in that way. And
So,
negative means that the psychotic features are maybe not so present.
so is positive and negative in those terms? Positive is something that's added, and negative is something that's taken away. So, okay, okay. And what inspired you to found this Psychosis Arts Collective?
Yeah, I suppose some creativity was something that I was always interested in. I think I wrote my first short story when I was like 7 years of age, I think. So I've been writing for a long time, expressing my feelings through writing. Even at sometimes I mightn't have realized I was expressing myself. I thought I was just writing stories or poems for the fun of it, but as I looked back on them, so even maybe from the age of 12, 13, 14, 15, the poems maybe started to get a bit deeper, a bit more introspective. And it was only then, so I had that experience with creativity before my episode. I had my psychotic episode at age 15. And from there, then, as I slowly started to recover and reintegrate back into, I suppose, school and college and everything, my poems started to become a bit more centered around psychology and mental health and my own psyche. Um, so that was my kind of creative journey. So I had always had that spark for it.
Can you tell us a little bit about your psychotic episode, if that's okay?
Absolutely, yeah. But I suppose I'll just maybe just finish the first part
Sorry,
of,
apologies.
and then yeah. So I suppose sorry to interrupt yourself, but I suppose then that led me in because of my experience with psychosis. That would have led into so I was realizing that other people might have used creativity to express themselves in that way as well. So, but yeah, no, absolutely. The psychotic episode is itself is an experience. It's a quite a visceral experience. And what I mean by that is when you're in it and when you have the delusions that feel so real to you, it feels you're completely immersed, like a video game or a movie. I don't know if you've ever gone to the cinema, and you just completely feel like everything is that's surrounding you, the surround sound, the screen. It's like you can't think about anything else. That's I suppose that's the best way to describe for me, anyways. What it felt like. Everything felt so real. There was real no escaping the thoughts that I was having.
And were they just thoughts, or did you have hallucinations, auditory and visual hallucinations?
So funny enough, I didn't actually have any hallucinations. I didn't see anything that wasn't there, and I didn't hear anything that wasn't that there. But I did think a lot of thoughts that seem to me now completely ridiculous. But in a way, in a strange way, they made sense at the time. So something that I struggle with is, and struggled with when I was younger, is kind of seeking validation or seeking kind of I wouldn't say attention, but like I do like to get affirmations and that kind of thing, and have since learned to give them to myself in a more healthy way. Um, but I suppose at the time I felt like there was something being organized for me, like a party when I was 15, or kind of an event to celebrate me and my contribution to science, even though I hadn't really made any contributions at a young age. And I felt like I was special, and I felt like I was being celebrated in public life and on the radio, that people were if they said something about a celebrity, I would have thought maybe that they were talking about me. And so that kind of makes sense because obviously if I was seeking validation, then my delusions were also building on that as well. So I'm not
Okay.
sure delusions and the psychotic symptoms. I suppose the features of psychosis are poorly misunderstood in the literature. I suppose there is some literature on delusions, but how they form and how they sustain themselves. I think there's something in that maybe that what comes before them influences the delusions. And even if you think we had classes in psychiatry in the masters, and they often told us that while delusions have to be separate from culture, as in to be diagnosed with psychosis, it can't be a delusion sometimes based around religion or thinking that God is speaking to you, because that's something that happens quite regularly. So it wouldn't be classed as a delusion really. But often in a weird way, they are tied to culture in a way because um, if you think about psychotic episodes in the 50s and 60s in Ireland, a lot of them would have thought that a lot of people that experienced that, I suppose, psychotic episode would have been thinking about God and Mary, that they were really involved in their lives and maybe seeing Mary, the Virgin Mary, in whatever statues and that kind of thing. Whereas now, these days, for me and for others, I know it's a lot about technology and social media and the news and CIA and that kind of thing. So while it has to be somewhat separate from culture, it's often tied to it in some way.
Hmm, that's interesting. I often think about people who are into conspiracy theories and other stuff like this, and there seems to be some relevance here. Not perfect match, but some relevance here in that I don't think people who believe conspiracy theories are always stupid or less intelligent people. In fact, I think the opposite. I think there's something about intelligence that makes people better at adjusting income and data to suit their narrative that they already have in their head. And I think more intelligent people are often better at doing that. So, do you think there's something in that kind of is there a correlation between intelligence and psychosis?
Can I just pause you for 2 seconds? I'm so sorry. Are you able to edit this out? I just need to plug in my laptop.
And go,
So it is. It's a bit of a it's a good question actually, because I suppose, as I mentioned in earlier, that if you take huge samples of people in studies, these are called genetic genome-wide association studies that they do. So they genotype huge amount of people that have psychosis or schizophrenia or schizoaffective or related disorders, and they genotype and test, let's say, thousands of people that don't have it. And when they compare them in terms of cognitive tests or IQ, a lot of the time you will see that there is cognitive deficits in people that have psychosis. But in saying that, that doesn't mean everyone that has psychosis is cognitive deficient. As you can see, like many people like myself will go on to college and they'll do quite well and they get good results. And it's not everyone, but overall, when you take hundreds of thousands of people and look at the data, you'll often see social cog deficits and different
yeah,
issues that people struggle with. But I like the way you phrased it, that maybe there's something in the way people analyze their own thoughts and the delusions that form from it. I suppose maybe there is something in that, that if you're very analytic and the delusions that come to you in the psychotic episode, that the way you think about them and the way you extrapolate them into something that can be applied to your own life. For example, I would have known a lot about science, so I was hugely interested in reading books about genetics, even from a young age. And to be able to take that information in and then apply it to myself, that's very different, I suppose, than someone that would maybe have no interest in kind of intellectual, I don't know, I suppose, top topics, I suppose, and maybe their
yeah,
delusions would look a bit different, but I suppose that's a bit reductive, because everyone's experience is personal to them and it's all valid. So even in the negative symptoms, if people are talking about their feelings or maybe some depressive episodes they're having following a psychotic episode, um, if they have, I don't know, if they're seen to have a lower cognitive score than me or whatever, that doesn't mean that's not valid. That's not real. Everyone's experience is valid and everyone is different and unique, as I said at the very start. Um, and no one's opinion is more important or less important than anyone else.
yeah. You touched on something there, which I think is important on this topic. That delusions and hallucinations might not be real, but the experience that somebody is living is very real. Regardless of that. So, um, how do you kind of get around that? Not get around it, but how do you fit that into your story? How do you go about accepting that there's a realness to the experience, but the experience itself is based on something that is not real?
That's a really interesting point. That's something I've actually struggled with in my recovery since the last 10 years, I suppose. So I'm 26 now. I've been looking back, and through therapy, I suppose, and psychotherapy, there's merit in looking back into your childhood and everything. Mightn't be the best, I suppose, therapeutic technique for everyone. Some people just prefer CBT and more kind of cognitive based interventions. But you've touched on something really important there. So they're not real. The delusions themselves, the thoughts about the CIA interacting with your life or the government or anything, that obviously can't be real. Um, but that the emotional side of it, or maybe the origin of that delusion. Why do you think that? Why is that your philosophy, or why is that your why does someone think that the CIA is after them, and why does someone think that God is intervening in their life? what's the difference there? I suppose genetics can explain some of the reasons for it, or maybe childhood trauma can. But it's really hard to know why someone has one delusion and why someone has the other. Why is it personalized to you? The content of the delusion. So there's actually great work being done on this. I think in Oxford there is some work being done on delusions, and I think Daniel Freeman, Professor Daniel Freeman, could be the name of academic at Oxford who does a lot on the kind of psychosis symptoms. Really interesting stuff. I haven't looked into it too much myself in terms of the literature, but I have done a lot of thinking about my own experience and
Yeah.
what that might mean for me, and that's valid as well, I guess.
Is there always with the experience of psychosis? Is there always an element of delusions of grandeur, shall we say, where you're putting yourself at the center of some story that's happening?
Absolutely, yeah, it happens a lot. And I suppose for me, that was the experience. Delusions of grandeur. I thought I was this very talented scientist, with no basis in fact, because obviously I was in fifth year in school. I hadn't contributed to the cause at all. But yeah, I know that that is very common, and very often people, maybe even with bipolar disorder, can have these as well. And they can have psychotic features where they might slip into a period of mania or a manic episode, as it's called, similar to a psychotic episode, but not full blown psychosis. And they often think they might be running a business or they might get a promotion, but that mightn't be the case at all. And I can remember I'd be talking to someone in school, and my immediate reaction was that they thought I was brilliant. They thought I was this social butterfly, and that wasn't the case. I was actually quite shy in school, but because of the psychosis, I had this increased, elevated sense of confidence and rigor that I could talk to anyone and I could be anything I wanted to be. And I suppose maybe that is true, but the way I was thinking about it was definitely a full blown delusion. And what's funny, so you mentioned, so it's them delusions, the grandiose delusions. But some people can have awful experiences of persecutory delusions as well, where maybe it's that could be related to, I suppose, a lower self esteem, where you think people are looking at you and judging you, and there's something wrong with you internally, and people are looking to seek that out and criticize you. But that mightn't be also that's similar to the grandiose side of it. There might be no fact there at all. There might be no basis in fact. And
Is there
it's
is
interesting what, like as we talked about it a few minutes ago, why does one person have one and why does one person have the other? And there are theories on that as well. Maybe if someone has higher self-esteem before the episode, maybe they'll have grandiose delusions during. But really, I think it's hard to research this stuff. How do you conduct a study ethically and longitudinally to find this stuff out? It's very difficult.
yeah, that brings me on to ethical issues kind of around how do you handle ethical issues around displaying art by people who may be in like a vulnerable mental state or maybe susceptible to vulnerable mental states?
Yeah, so that's a good point. And we'd only share art publicly in galleries that we set up that people are comfortable with sharing. So the people that are involved, the people with lived experience will share the art that they're comfortable with sharing. And I see what you're getting at. So I suppose maybe you're referring to people that are in an episode or something like that that will be sharing art. Wouldn't typically be the case that we would engage with someone that's in a full blown psychotic episode, probably because they mightn't be in the best place, and we try to validate everyone's experiences, and everyone's experiences are important and important to them. But typically, if someone is very unwell, that maybe they wouldn't be contributing to the collective. It's more in recovery that the months that follow or the years that follow, that's what we tend to see in coming in. But what's interesting, and so you yourself were at the launch of our last exhibition, Drive Together,
Yeah.
just this week, and you've seen a video made and edited by someone who actually took VHS footage during their episode and then edited it after. So they edited the video only this year, and the artist is unnamed, and they wanted to protect their identity and everything like that. And that was completely fine. But that showed for me what it felt like during an episode, and I could resonate with that as well. It was similar, the flashing lights, the banging at the door, the kind of intensity of it all, and the visceralness of it all. Um, and that's important because, as I said on the night in my speech, I said there's two sides of the coin. There's the positive recovery stories, and there's the recovery movement, and there's the lived experience movement in psychology and in mental health. But you can't shy away from the negative aspects of it. You can't shy away from the hardship that people go through, and you can't shy away from the difficult experiences that people have, because that's important to them. They remember that, and I remember that, and everyone remembers their episode in some ways. Mightn't remember all of it. They do know that it was difficult, and you have to acknowledge that as well. You know.
Um, how long did your own episode? Was it a single episode, and how long did it go on for?
Yeah, Dahi. So I had one episode, one psychotic episode, and it lasted for, it builds up. So mine built up maybe for a month and a half, and then on Christmas Day of all days, it peaked, and I actually was brought into A&E by my family. I voluntarily went as well, and I was, I suppose, sectioned in a way to. I'm not sure is that the right word, but I was voluntarily brought to CAMS through A&E, and I was there for about a month in recovery and coming out of the psychosis and taking antipsychotics and therapy and everything. But yeah, about a month beforehand, month and a half, and then a month after, slowly coming back to reality. But not everyone. Everyone has a different experience. Everyone has different lengths, and everyone has different, as I said, delusions, hallucinations, and sometimes it takes longer. Sometimes it takes shorter, especially if it's. I suppose some people might have drug-induced psychosis as well. That could be a more isolated incident, and some people have treatment-resistant schizophrenia, and it could take years and years.
You mentioned drug-induced psychosis. There is a fair amount of links, I think, and correlations been made between the use of marijuana and weed smoking and schizophrenia, which and the link between schizophrenia and psychosis. Could you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, so I suppose just an important point to clarify that not everyone that has a psychotic episode or has psychosis will go on to develop full-blown schizophrenia or full-blown schizoaffective disorder like myself. It could be related to other things, or it could be more isolated. And it can be difficult as well to get a diagnosis because of the criteria and the DSM, the diagnostic manual, for psychiatry. But yeah, drug-induced, the stats I think are actually quite daunting. It is quite a high. I'm not sure exactly what the stats are for the links between marijuana or cannabis use to developing psychotic features, but I think it's quite significant. I think there is, I suppose, a movement to legalize marijuana and cannabis in Ireland and across the world. I'd be cautious on that one. I think it isn't as low as some people like to point out. So a lot of the time, the campaigners will say it's a very low percentage. It's actually not. I can't remember the exact figure. I think it does happen quite often.
Yeah, I remember studying about that, and I think there is kind of an epigenetic component to it. Whereas if you are kind of a genetically susceptible to schizophrenia, then it can be brought out by other drugs. Um, could you speak to a bit to the heritability of schizophrenia and psychotic episodes? I mean, I think there's a lot of people who'd be worried if they have a history of schizophrenia in their family, and they'd be worried themselves about how it might appear in their lives, or if. Can you speak a bit about that?
Yeah, so I suppose when we talk about genetic risk and heritability, it can be quite daunting for people that maybe have a parent or have a brother or a sibling. Um, I'm pretty sure that the heritability rate of schizophrenia is 80%, or roughly 80%. Now, I'll explain a little bit what that means. It doesn't mean that if you have a parent or whatever, a sibling, that you have a 80% chance of inheriting it. It means that 80% of developing schizophrenia is owed to genetics, and roughly 20%, or maybe 25%, depending on the person, is owed to environmental factors. So things like childhood trauma, even living in a city increases your risk slightly by a small percentage. Urbanicity, things like that. Childhood trauma is a big one. Yeah, environmental factors, and the bigger half or the bigger proportion is genetics and genomics. Genomic sequencing has, I suppose, told us that, and the whole new way of GWAS, as I mentioned earlier, genomic wide association studies, which I've done a little bit of work on. And as I kind of alluded to a few minutes ago, I suppose you take huge populations, huge samples of the population that have experience with psychosis, so schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, as diagnosed in the DSM, so they have to have a diagnosis. And you sequence all their DNA, genotype them, like I've done actually that in the past in a study. I've been a part of one of them studies. And then they take hundreds of thousands, as many as you can get, of controls. So the UKB or the UK Biobank has this data, and you can pull from that and do studies, and you can kind of elucidate patterns or, I suppose, genes or parts of genes that have mutations that are related to the risk of developing the disorder. It's very early days in terms of understanding the full biological basis of the disorders. There's a lot of work to be done, and it's very slow, difficult work. And I could explain a bit about why it's difficult and why it takes so long. But I suppose coming back to the heritability, the more simple, I suppose, way of kind of discovering that pattern or that stat is through twin studies actually. So because identical twins are very interested in the fact that they have a 100% the same DNA, but their environment might be different depending on what lives they live in. That, so as you can imagine, why that's important in separating environment from genetics. If one person has a different experience, but they have the same DNA, then you can kind of see the patterns that way.
And if there is a history of it in your family, um, is there a stage in your life where you've grown past the risk areas, where if it hasn't come up, if it hasn't taken form in you, and you haven't had a psychotic episode, is there an area where you can, a time in your life where you can say, okay, look, it's probably not going to happen to me?
Yeah, so I'd be cautious in kind of trying to predict, and I suppose I wouldn't be too worried if you had a family member. I suppose it's quite still rare. I know I think it's roughly 1% of the population that go on to develop schizophrenia. Now it's not that rare. That's actually quite a large proportion. But I wouldn't be too worried with family members. And as you mentioned, I suppose the age range usually, the most people that have schizophrenia or schizoaffective would be diagnosed maybe somewhere between the age 15, which is quite young, which is actually I was just on the lower end of it myself, and then 25 or 30. So somewhere in between then is where we see the most people being diagnosed. That's not to say people, there's always outliers,
Mm.
but as I said, I wouldn't be too majorly worried. And I suppose the reason for that is there's so many factors that come into play. So if you think of mutations in the DNA, so one amino acid change or one letter AGTC of the DNA code, um, we can track them over the studies that I mentioned, the GWAS studies. Currently, I think there's hundreds of single nucleotide polymorphisms, is what they're called. So single change in the DNA, and there's hundreds of them that are associated, and they all have a very weak effect. So it's a lot of small effects that add up to a big effect. And only, I suppose, with a perfect storm, I suppose, for want of a better phrase, with childhood trauma, urbanicity, these kind of things, marijuana, drug use, all these kind of things come together to form schizophrenia. So it's very different for everyone. The mix of genes you have and the mix of environment you have, and then there are some genetic components maybe that might be different. There's longer stretches of the DNA that will contribute. So CNVs or copy number variants, I think is the acronym. They will have a bigger effect, but they're more rare.
Okay. Okay. This might sound like a strange question, but if you see the cover photo, you might figure what I'm getting at. Do other animals suffer from psychosis?
That's a really good question, actually. And as far as I know, I don't think so. I don't think so.
Okay.
Um, I could be wrong on that. You'd have to fact
Yeah.
check me on that one, Dahi. But as far as I know, we don't typically see psychotic features in other animals. And
Okay.
I'm not
So
sure
for,
exactly the
for me,
reason
that means it's
why.
language based.
Yeah, it could be language based. It could be somewhat language based. Yeah, and in different, and that's actually an interesting point because in different cultures, the psychotic features could be different, and that came up in our discussion the last night at the launch of our exhibition, the psychotic, the Psychosis Arts Collective. We seen that cultural contexts of psychosis might look very different in different countries and different languages, and yeah. So I suppose one of the projects that I worked on in college was the use of semantics.
Hmm.
So semantic, the meaning of words or that kind of thing, you know? So I kind of hypothesized, and it was only a humble study design module, so I didn't actually get to do the research myself, but I came up with the project that, and there was a basis for it in the literature that maybe if you look at people with schizophrenia and delusions, so if they have a very high delusion score or whatever on the measures that we use, I won't go into that, but that they might have lower, I suppose, they might be able to dissociate the meanings of things that aren't related. You get me? So things in delusions, you relate things to other things that don't have a relationship. So I relate someone on the radio talking about a celebrity, as I said, to me, but they're not related. And there's a response in the brain called the N400 response, and that's if you say a word like dog, and then you're shown a word that's cat or another animal, that will elicit a certain response. And then if I say a word like dog and then I say a word like table, they're not related. And I kind of hypothesize that maybe someone with schizophrenia, I think there is some research on this, that response might look a bit different in the brain.
Okay.
And you can do this
Okay.
with EEG or the caps.
Yeah,
Some people have done this and got some results, but it's early days, as I said.
that's good. That's yeah, that's interesting stuff. And it's stuff that I think people who might have interest in schizophrenia or psychosis might be able to look more into themselves because it's quite complex studies. And um, when I did go to your launch the last night, and when I went into your online gallery, there was a lot of stuff that stirred me emotionally, that kind of hit me hard. Even your poem that we opened with there, it hit me hard, and part of it made me think, okay, this is hitting me hard. Did I have psychotic episodes? Did I suffer from psychosis sometimes that I haven't recognized? Um, and also, then I that makes me think about people who have diagnosed episodes and how this art might impact them. And does it bring back memories? Would there be a possibility that could bring somebody into another episode? How do you
Interesting
balance
point.
that?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I suppose you might be talking about more the kind of triggering aspects of the art, and maybe ones that are very kind of vibrant and kind of hit you hard, as you said. I'd say the risk is quite low, and I've actually talked to a couple of psychiatrists about this and psychologists, and they were happy to share the art with outpatients and inpatients, and I didn't think there was an issue there. But you've mentioned, I suppose, bringing back memories and kind of bringing that experience up again and making it more real. I think it's quite unlikely. And now I'm not an expert, so it's kind of funny that I draw on my experiences as an expert by experience is what we call it in the business, an expert by training. So I'm not really an expert by training. Maybe with the masters, maybe you could say that I've gained some sort of knowledge. But in my humble opinion, I would say the risk of triggering psychotic features in someone through art is quite low. Now, unless you're on the threshold already, But in talking to the teams in the hospitals, I think they're happy to share it with kind of anyone.
Is
If
there?
you, as long as you preface it with a trigger warning, and I suppose
Yeah,
teams, occupational therapists, art therapists will always kind of they have good sense of someone. They have some sense of a person, a patient, and they'll be able to kind of judge that on the day. Should I show them this? Should we work on this today? And they'll use their kind of expert opinion. That's worth a lot more than mine to kind of see who's fit for it, I guess.
yeah. I do wonder if there's an element of being able to look at it from the outside as an observer of art, comparing to being in it. There's a definite difference there. But how do you think your education in psychology changes how you process looking back at your psychotic episode?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. And I suppose my psychology background is limited. I didn't do an undergrad in psychology, but I definitely master's in neuroscience and the master's, yeah, the clinical neuroscience aspect of it is very interesting to me. The genetic side, I suppose, opened up a different, I suppose, door. I was starting to think about, what, as we said, 20% and the 80% heritability. What happened in my childhood or what would have happened? And I think on an individual level, it's hard to know if you think about the science of it all. As I said, these studies that look at patterns of childhood trauma and everything like that, they're using huge amounts of data from hundreds of thousands of people, as I said. So when you break it down to an individual level, it's the patterns are low. That everything is very common things that all have a small effect that come together to have a perfect storm kind of effect. So I tend to not think about it. People will there's kind of an aspect of kind of singling out experiences in your past and thinking maybe that caused my schizophrenia. Now sometimes in extreme cases that could be the case, but for me it's I like to think about that stuff on an intellectual level for my studies or for my work and even in workshops and that kind of stuff. Um, but the main thing for me is that how I manage it now, how I with someone with schizoaffective disorder, how do I manage my mood and what can I focus on that I can change and that I can work on for the future and for my recovery in the now. And I think there is a lot to be said for psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is huge. It has its place, as does psychiatry, and as does medication and antipsychotics and mood stabilizers. Um, but I think if you analyze your childhood too much, I think mightn't be always the best idea on an
No,
individual level.
because you'll find something anyways. None of us were ever completely happy as kids. If we were, our parents weren't doing their jobs right. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, like no childhood is perfect, and as I said,
No.
it takes a lot of data to see them patterns come out.
What you mentioned pharmaceuticals there? What role do pharmaceuticals play in the treatment of psychosis?
A big role, yeah, a big role. So I suppose one of the things it's hard to reconcile is that mm, antipsychotics are the first line treatment for a psychotic episode. That they work. They do reduce symptoms of psychosis. That's a hot topic at the moment in the anti-psychiatry movement and everything like that. I don't want to comment too much on this. There are people that are against medication, there's people that for it, and there's people that are somewhat in the middle. I am of the opinion that antipsychotics or any kind of medication for any mental disorder should not be given in isolation. I do think that talk therapy, CBT, CFT, DBT, all the good stuff should be used in conjunction with medication and
Okay.
antipsychotics because going into a doctor, we've all heard them stories. Someone goes to the GP and they might have depressive symptoms and they're given an antidepressant and they get told to go home and take it. That's not really what we're looking for here, especially with the lived experience and the recovery movement and more holistic ways of doing things. It's more, I suppose, yeah, more holistic. But that's not that doesn't negate the importance of of medication. And yeah, as I said, reconciling the fact that don't really understand the biology of the disorder, or many mental disorders, the biological basis of them in the brain and the connections in the brain and the genetics. Like we do know a lot, but we still need to know a lot more. And people often say, how can we give medication for something that we don't know how it works? But we do know that the medication does work. So I suppose to a certain degree, it does help. And I think we can't totally forget about it. And we can't totally forget about psychological interventions either. So we need both.
Does electroshock therapy still have a place?
I think for certain disorders, not 100% sure how often it's used, but I think it's only used in extreme cases. Maybe treatment resistant, certain disorders that are treatment resistant. I'm not 100% sure. And I know in the past it was used a lot more, but as we know, it's quite invasive and it can have side effects as well. So it preferably not used, I would say.
Yeah, yeah. I think Hemingway had electroshock therapy towards the end, but he had a lot of damage going into it already. So
Mm, okay.
it's I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, or it's got this element. You touched on it there yourself, where we know that some drugs work and some drugs help people. It's been shown that electroshock therapy has helped people in certain ways, but we don't exactly know the mechanics of how it goes from the biological side of it to the lived experience side of it. And that's kind of, there's a lot of philosophy involved in that. There's a lot of theory of mind involved in that. There's a lot of there's still a lot of distance between the biological side and the lived experience side. Do you feel that?
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for like the person-centered side of interventions. And that's part of sharing the vision, which is the national kind of guidance document for the new wave of mental health treatment in Ireland. And sharing the vision does outline that person-centered interventions are huge. The medical model is getting there. It's important, but it's not the be all and end all. And the DSM, diagnostic manual for psychiatry, is not perfect. It works for some cases, and in general, it's a decent approach, but it's not perfect. So the person centered aspect of mental health treatment is huge. So that means it's everyone's experience is very important, and that treatment plans should really be built or kind of designed in, I suppose, in line with what the person feels is right for them and what's important to them. And I suppose if you look at certain recovery, I suppose, plans or whatever like that, some people might need CBT, some people might need psychotherapy, some people might need employment support, so that the functional side of things can improve. So maybe someone struggles with finding a job, and that could be huge for them. And some people might struggle with their thoughts, and CBT could be huge for them. So it's different for everyone, and yeah, it should be personalized and
Mm,
more tailored approach, you could say.
mm. Uh, yeah. Moving back to the art collective, what's been the response, or have you had a response from kind of the art community? How does the art community see the art that comes through the Psychosis Arts Collective?
Yes, it's something we're trying to constantly do is grow online and grow on social media. The collective mostly operates online, and we have a few in-person events, as you know. Um, and we have got some good feedback. Like I suppose the quality of the art is brilliant. The quality of the art itself. We have some professional artists on board, so we have I think maybe two, three, four professional artists that is their full-time job, and they're quite known in their spaces and their fields that they are very talented. Um, but I'd love to see more interaction with, I suppose, maybe something like the Galway Arts Festival or different galleries that might show our work around the country or different exhibition spaces. And for that, yeah. So you're saying people maybe that are really big in the art world, but don't know anything about psychosis or mental health, and how can we bridge that gap to kind of create a more I suppose, more reach for our collective, and maybe bring it to that stage. The next stage is, okay, we're good at lived experience, we're good at communicating our experience, but why not make art that can be enjoyed by everyone and really show that we as a collective have something to offer, not just for mental health, not just for people that are interested in psychology, but we want to create something that's really memorable. And I suppose that's the aim, is creativity, and let's share that work.
Yeah, and would you like to see like an art genre of psychosis driven art, or would you rather see psychosis driven, not psychosis driven art? I'm probably using the wrong words here, but do you get what I'm saying? Is it going to have its own genre? Is that what you're aiming for, or would you like it to merge with the rest of art? Because I'll let you answer that question.
Yeah, so it depends on the person, I guess. Every person in the collective approaches it differently. So some people just draw for the sake of creativity. So some people love drawing random paintings or writing poems about kind of anything, and that's their way of dealing with their experience. And then some people, like myself, maybe write poetry or tailor their art very specifically to psychosis and for the even the negative symptoms, positive symptoms like that. It's an interesting point, yeah. Like, does someone might think that to join the collective they have to tailor it towards mental health, or they have to tailor it to psychology? That's not really the case. We accept every kind of art and every kind of experience.
Okay.
But yeah, it would be cool that you mentioned genre. Like, the whole thing about that collective is that we're reclaiming the narrative of psychosis and stigma and all the things that go along with misconceptions, and to create a genre that would be, it's a good idea actually. I'm gonna write that down.
And what? How do you think we're doing at destigmatizing this?
In some ways it's good, in some ways it's not so good. The research shows, and it's actually a research study that I was part of in the University of Galway, we're quite good at, in well, at least in print media online, in the different news articles that come out. We're actually quite good at avoiding very pejorative language or very stigmatizing language in the news. But what we're not so good at is including voices of lived experience, or including ideas or notions or writing that directly challenge stigma. So for someone to say psychosis is not associated with violence, and to really spell that out for people, that doesn't happen as often as you think. So yeah, quite good at avoiding the very, very serious pejorative parts of it, or stigmatizing or offensive language, but to directly challenge stigma and fight it is a different thing, and that's what we do. So as I said, we're
Okay.
reclaiming the narrative and we're trying to improve every day. There is a quite good organization in Ireland called Headline, who monitor the media for mental health, stigma, and that kind of thing. And funny enough, actually, a great journalist for mental health in Ireland is goes by the name of Neve Jimenez, and she wrote an article about the art collective last year, and it was actually featured in the Irish Independent. And that article, funny enough, got nominated for an award, the Shine Audience Choice Award. So we all know about Shine and anti-stigma campaigns, and that's now nominated for an award with Headline. So really happy to see that that's being taken into account, that art has its place in this stigma fight, I guess.
That's great. That's great. It's great that it's getting the attention it deserves. You know, it really is. I think as a society, maybe we've definitely leaned in the past century towards really stigmatizing mental health. Um, I never lived a few hundred years ago, but I always imagined that there was maybe a little bit less stigma throughout history. Not always, of course, but you know, there was people were just accepted for who they were, and if they were a bit off or a bit different or a bit had their own way of looking at things, that was often seemed to be more accepted in history. But there's also plenty of examples of where it wasn't, with the witch burning and the many other things that went along with it. But when I mentioned a genre for psychosis art, I think we could go down through history and we would already have maybe quite a large percentage of art throughout history has been done by people who perhaps suffered from psychosis or some symptoms. To name just a few, we had Van Gogh, who of course ended up cutting his ear off. Edvard Munch and that famous painting, the Scream painting. Um, and that seems to mean a lot to people with mental health. And even looking at it, that if anybody's unfamiliar with it, it's the mouth open of the figure and seeming to be screaming. Um, that's impactful. That is, but that seems to say a lot about psychosis. We have Francisco Goya, who was a painter. We have Lewis Wayne, who was a painter. Richard Dadd, a British painter. Antonin Artaud, who's playwright, actor, theorist, philosopher type. Michelangelo, Jackson Pollock, Sylvia Plath, the poet who sadly committed suicide. Frida Kahlo, who painted some self-portraits. With Sid Barrett of Pink Floyd. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys. John Clare, who was also a poet. And there's many artists down through history who seem to have had psychotic episode and had them feed their art to a certain extent. Is there something about psychosis, schizophrenia, these type of mental health phenomena? Is there something in that feeds art in ways
I
that?
love that question. I love that question because I've often thought about that myself, and I've tried to do research, but it's hard to know. It's hard to know how to measure creativity, if that makes sense. Like
Mm,
you might say someone is a good person who thinks outside the box, and you might, a person is very good at art and very talented, and everyone's talented in their own way. But how do you measure that on a scientific level or with a psychological measure or neuroscience level? It's hard to do. Um, and could you say there's a link between mental illness and being a creative person? The answer is I don't know, and I'm not sure does anyone know that. I suppose you could do a large study on it and see could you take thousands of people that typical neurotypical and people that have mental illness and see, but it's hard to know. And I think maybe the themes that are communicated would differ, but it's very difficult to see is there a causal link or even an association between the two. And it's yet to be seen. But I suppose there definitely is a link between art therapy or kind of artistic expression and recovery. So we kind of do know, and I suppose that was spoken about at our exhibition launch the last night, that there is merit to using art and using creativity for recovery and for mental well-being. But is there a link? The origin of the thing, the actual just being mentally unwell and being creative, is there a link there? On any kind of level, a genetic level or anything like that. Hard to know. I think it would be interesting to study
mhm.
that actually.
Nietzsche had two concepts around art, the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And the Apollonian would have been the ordered element of it, and the Dionysian then would have been the more chaotic, the more primal element to us. Um, and when both of them met, when you could bring some order to the chaotic, you could make some great art. Uh, and I wonder sometimes if artists, real artists, can spend more time in that Dionysian element, in that primality, in that chaos, and bring some order to it then for us to see. Bring some order to it for the audience. They can't explain it fully. And even poetry doesn't explain fully in words. It's almost what poetry doesn't say that hits us. It's what's between the lines, not the actual kind of words themselves. But I do wonder if there's some link to primality, some link to chaos that artists can have, uh, that they can bring back to us and show us normal people, if I can even call myself that, that can bring it back to us. I watched an interview with Ethan Hawke recently, and he was talking about Robin Williams and Philip Seymour Hoffman, He said he was doing a scene with Robin Williams, and he said Robin Williams was being Robin Williams, his full self, his engaging self. He's witty, he's ad hoc in a lot of it. And he said it was great. It was fantastic. He said he felt the energy off it. And then they went back to kind of the canteen where they were all having coffee, and he was sitting around with a few of the actors talking and drinking coffee. And he looked over to the corner, and he said Robin Williams was over there fully depleted, drained. And he said it doesn't come for free. But the Philip Seymour Hoffman was another guy, he said, who used to give it everything, and it used to really almost take something from him. So for them kind of artists, it didn't seem to come for free. It almost didn't seem therapeutic. It seemed something else. It seemed like they were giving us something that was actually costing them something. Whereas the arts collective aims for a more fulfilling thing for the artist, a more therapeutic kind of thing for the artist. I wonder, can you speak to that? Is there something that people in the arts collective are giving us that's costing them something, or is it all for free?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I suppose it depends kind of maybe what the reason is you create art. And I might speak my own experience if that's okay, just to
Please,
kind of highlight the point. You talked a little bit about the primal side of it, or the emotional side of it, maybe, and the kind of more instinctive traits that we have, or innate traits. For me, and I'm not speaking for everyone. I'm not speaking on behalf of everyone in the collective. It might be different for other people, and I'd love to chat to them about it. And in in my own brain, I think there's something going on in the old brain. So we have the old brain and the new brain. It's the maybe the amygdala as an example of the emotional side of things, and the prefrontal cortex is our logical brain. For me, I'll sit down on a blank page on Google Docs or even paper, and I'll just vomit words, and I'll just talk about my emotions, and I'll just whatever comes out, and whatever metaphor I use, it'll just come out. And I tend to write poems quite quickly. It'll be done in maybe half an hour, 20 minutes. But then I'll go back with my this part of my brain, and I'll analyze it, and I'll work it out, and I'll see maybe what words fit best. What can I change a rhyming scheme, or can I change the structure, or change a word and a metaphor? And I think that part, that primal part, or the emotional part, that will stay pretty much intact. The theme of the poem will stay intact. But the way I form it, and you talked about putting order on the disorder or whatever like that, putting order to the more chaotic side of it. I suppose that's the part that we display to the audience. I suppose that's how we make it palatable. I kind of want, for me, anyways, I want to make it so that it makes sense. Um, but in a funny way, it actually makes more sense to me as well. So when I was doing a lot of therapy back a couple of years ago, I'd maybe go away and I'd write a poem in the 2 weeks in between the appointments, and then I'd go back to the appointment and I'd read that poem, and me and the therapist would kind of analyze it together. And a lot of the stuff that comes out is primal, but then when you think about it and you talk about it, it makes a lot of sense. And that's strange because we think we're more aware. We think we're very aware of emotions. Some people, some people think that they're fine and there's nothing going on beneath the surface and they're stable. And then maybe a couple of years down the line, they realize, oh well, maybe there was something going on there, and that kind of way. And
yeah,
maybe the thoughts, the more logical side of our brains come later, and the emotional kind of um, aspect of it is often, the instinctual part, and it can work both ways. But yeah, to come back, I suppose, to the collective, and as you said, is there a cost to the art? It's a good question. I suppose how you do it and the energy that you put into it. And maybe I suppose for some people, if people cater to the audience too much, I think that could be an issue. And I think there is some merit to maybe, I think, is it Rick Rubin, the music, I don't know if that's his name, but he's a music manager. I think he managed maybe the Chili Peppers and that kind of thing. He kind of believes this idea that you should cater for yourself first, or create the art for yourself first. I think if you maybe cater to the audience, you're trying to impress and dazzle. Um, mightn't be the best way. It might lose yourself in that process, and the art really should kind of come from within and
Hmm.
express your
I,
own
I
experience.
think, and it's something I struggle with on this podcast, is trying to stay authentic, but still kind of um, care about what people want to see. Do you know what I mean? And
Mm.
it is a struggle, and I can't imagine.
It's
I
a fine
imagine that
line.
it's a fine line. I imagine that artists struggle with it even more. Um, but I do. I think there's something to what I think Nietzsche's onto something with the Dionysus. I think there's something to the letting go of the ordered world to be able to put the art down on paper or on video or wherever you're putting it, and that has to come from that what you call the amygdala, what I'd call the Dionysian element, and then bring an order to it. Something one of the artists said at your launch, I forget her name now, it escapes me, but she said there was something in the process part of it. She had been doing prints, and there was something about the process of doing prints that she found therapeutic in a sense. Uh, I wonder about the flow experience. I'm sure you're familiar with it. Csikszentmihalyi's flow experience. I always pronounce his name wrong. But there's something about flow experience and process too, I feel, that you can kind of allow yourself to get into the flow of a process. Am I making sense? And is there something therapeutic in that, in finding that flow experience, not just in art, but in life in general? Is there something about the flow experience that it really appeals to me? I find the flow experience is actually what I strive to get into every day in whatever I'm doing. If I can find a flow, I feel like that's a day that's lived well.
Mm.
Um, so, do you find something about the flow experience in art, or as the lady mentioned, in the process element of doing these arts?
Yeah, I think you touched on something really, really vital there, is that it's kind of like life. It's like a metaphor for life, creating or that process. So you have the idea, you have your starting point. You, okay, I'm going to make a painting now. I'm going to write a poem, and then you have the poem, the finished product. But it's that piece in between. So I suppose related to something like, and I suppose the person you're talking about is Lisa Callahan, was actually a really, really
Lisa,
talented
yeah.
artist, and she
Hmm.
co-founded the collective with myself.
Excellent.
And she talked about the process of creating the art. But if you think something like simple, like me starting college, and then me graduating, so you see, okay, my first day in college, I went to the lecture, you know, this is going to be great, and then you have me graduating and the pictures of the family and the hat on and everything like that. But what you didn't see is I actually dropped out for a year because of my condition. I spent many nights, you know, in turmoil, thinking about the next day or thinking about an exam. Or I really, really struggled. Had to start therapy. I changed medication 3 times, I think. Um, and that's a metaphor for art, I think, and art is a metaphor for that. You might scribble out the poem 3 times, or you might go back to it a couple of weeks later and finish it or edit it, and it's not always easy. And I suppose there's a merit, I think, to the difficult side of things, processing. So maybe when you're creating a poem or a painting or whatever it is, that difficult feelings will come up, but then you create something beautiful out of that, or you get the degree, or you get the promotion of the job. And I suppose the two, I suppose, yeah, I don't want to be too philosophical, for want of a better word, or too kind of pretentious, but I think that process, that journey that you go on, I suppose that there's the kind of cliche thing. It's not the destination; it's the journey. There's a lot to be said for that, I think.
Is there is there parts of this journey that you've been on um, that you find more rewarding than other parts of it? Is there moments where you said that was a great moment, that I'm putting that in the bank, you know?
Yeah, and like if we even go back to a week ago, that launch, it was brilliant. Uh, I think there was 40 people at the launch for the collective exhibition. Everyone came up, patted me on the back and everything. But they're not often the best. They're not often the best measures of how we're doing. You know, uh, a great a great measure for me and a great rewarding part of my life could be waking up in the morning and going out for a coffee with a friend, or waking up in the morning and on a Monday and thinking that okay, my job is fulfilling and I'm going to enjoy my job for the next week. And really interesting, actually, a psychologist said to me at another work event, it was similar to the launch. We launched a novel service, which is our service, the Discovery College, which is was founded by Chloe Costello, my supervisor, the first of its kind that did recovery education workshops for young people. But anyways, the psychologist said to me on the day, he said, not all days are going to be like this. You know, there's going to be a grind, and I think if you can find small moments of joy in the grind and in everyday life, because not every day is a picnic, not every day is a launch or a big event and claps on the back. Even a therapist said to me before, he said, if you can just enjoy doing the dishes, you know, it
Yeah,
sounds silly, but like if you look out, like the fact that you have hot water, you can have a hot shower in the morning. I think, as Jimmy Carr said, of all people, he said, "Be thankful that you can have a hot shower in the morning." And you know, they're often the moments that we forget about, and we lose ourselves in career and everything like that. But find joy in the simple things can be just as good.
and gratitude. If you look around and just find reasons to be grateful, and I've listened to that Jimmy Carr moment as well. Uh, yeah, he's very good. He talked about we're the first people in history to have hot showers. Like, 50 years ago, people didn't really have hot showers. Here we are going in there crying in our lovely hot shower. You know? But what's next for you? What's next for the Arts Collective? What's the next? Where are we going with this?
Yeah, so next for the art collective, at least, what's next for me is a bigger question. But the art collective, I said it last year and I'll say it again this year. I want to make the collective a collective. I want it to be for everyone. So in mental health, there's a word called co-production or co-creation. It's where everyone has a say. So everyone's on the same level. Psychiatrists, doctors, politicians, everyone, psychologists, everyone comes together, and people with lived experience are on the same level playing field. And everyone creates a service or creates a research study or creates an art collective together. And that's what I want to see. I want people to come on the Zoom calls. I want them to speak up and make their voice heard that, okay, we should do this or we should do that. And then eventually create art that is co produced as well. So maybe a publication or the next exhibition that everyone comes together. Because I find sometimes I might be a bit of a director, or which I am, I suppose, the director of the collective, but maybe a bit of a dictator. I suppose I could find myself making all the decisions, but that really shouldn't be the way. It's essential to start something like that. I think from the start, ideally, you can have co-production, true co-productions with everyone involved. But to kind of get the jump start or kind of get the collective going, people need to make decisions quickly, and that thankfully was me, and I made the right decisions and grew it and expanded. But now I think it's time for the collective aspect and make everyone feel that they have something to contribute and make people realize that their input is important and have, I suppose, on a kind of legal level or a kind of practical level, making a CLG or company limited but guarantee could be an option, just so we can get funding and that kind of thing and increase our status legally, so that we can make donations or take donations and get government public funding and expand. But yeah, on a more philosophical level or a more kind of deeper level, I want it to be for everyone and make it collective.
And is it countrywide now? Are you involved with other universities, other educational institutions, mental health institutions around the country to kind of get everybody involved?
That's the plan. Yeah, we've some contacts in different universities. I won't name them all. So obviously the University of Galway have strong ties to trying to work with RCSI as well. We have international ties. So we have ties to the UK. So we have some people involved in the collective that maybe tried to start something going on over there with local institutions. There's a lot of interest. But I always find in the kind of PPI work or public patient involvement work, and it mental health in general, you'll email someone and someone will text you on LinkedIn and say, we should connect and we should do this. And then it takes weeks, it takes months to see that happen. You'll often see, oh, I'll connect with you and we'll do something on this or we'll collaborate. But it could take time and it's a slow process. But I was happy to see that maybe some of the services, maybe some of the mental health services, inpatient, outpatient units in Galway might help us integrate into their services. And then obviously next year we're applying for a grant, or we have applied for a grant to communicate research themes through art. So University of Galway have kindly, I suppose, agreed to partner with us on the assumption that we'll get funding to do a series of researcher artist collaborations and then communicate themes through that way.
Okay, that sounds really interesting. Actually, I'd be interested to see that. Do you know Cormac Culkeen? He has a creative writing magazine in Galway called Ragra. He's a
I
poet.
think I've heard the name, but maybe you could maybe explain a bit more.
Yeah, I'll have to try and get you in touch because you could probably get some of the poetry work into that from the collective. It might be good. And so, what's next for you personally? I see your jobs there are very involved in mental health. That seems to be what holds your interests and where your career is headed. So, how do you hope to grow that?
Yeah, so I suppose the main goal for now is to stick with the Discovery College West service based out of Roscommon, and that's funded by the HSE, which is a really really novel initiative. And it's great to see us even yesterday or the day before Friday going into schools, working with young people, early prevention, early intervention, teaching people and working with people and facilitating conversations around mental health for the people that are a bit younger than ourselves, but definitely not short of experience. I mean, their experience is just as valid as ours, and we can learn a lot from them, and they can learn a lot from us. It's really powerful, that job, because the co-production aspect of it. Every workshop that we facilitate and deliver to people is co-produced. So we have a LGBT plus workshop coming up, and we worked with a couple of people that say have experience of LGBT plus, and they helped us put together the slides and the workshop and the content and the session plans, and that's huge. That's a big step for mental health in Ireland. I'm so glad to be a part of that. The
So,
second part
I
of that
used to know
job,
it's co-produced by the users, by the service
yeah,
users. Oh,
yeah,
great, great.
absolutely, yeah, co-created and everything, yeah, put together. I suppose the second part of that job is I'm leading actually out on a research project which measures the efficacy or the impact of that work. So when we deliver workshops in schools or in the community, in the library, for example, like that, we want to see what effect that has. So how do people improve after a workshop? How do people improve after two, three workshops? And to measure that scientifically, we're actually going to have to come up with our own measurement tool, which for recovery education is a huge step forward. So to have a tool or some sort of scale that measures recovery education, it doesn't exist. So I'm happy to be leading out on that project as the principal investigator. And we're just applying for ethics at the moment to get it all above board, and really excited to see where that goes. Secondly, obviously, you mentioned the collective, so grow that out. And then number three, I think for me, I do want to get into things like this podcasting, content creation, I suppose social media, maybe have a bit more of a voice on all things lived experience, all things psychosis, and all things mental health. And one thing I'd love to fight for, and one thing I'd love to see, I suppose, expanded is PPI equality. So it's a thing I really believe in. So PPI stands for public patient involvement, as I mentioned. So this is the co-production piece. This is where patients, service users, participants in studies get to have a say in how things are done. But in across the world, and even I was talking to colleagues in Australia on the MOST trial, um, the moderated online social therapy, they also see a bit of a gap there, a bit of a disconnect where people are doing great work, both sides of the coin. So researchers are doing amazing work, service providers are doing amazing work in early intervention, that kind of thing. And PPI contributors, so the service users are doing unbelievable work. But there is a bit of a gap in pay, representation, remuneration, all these kind of things where maybe the lived experience part of it is maybe underrepresented. So their voices there could be heard more, and they could also be compensated a bit more, and me included in that for the work they do. It's improving. It's better than it was 5, 10 years ago. But there's a lot of work to be done in that PPI quality piece.
Yeah, that's all very good, and I imagine it's very rewarding on a personal level. Actually, spending your time, your energy, your attention, your life helping others who are struggling. I think that's very rewarding. Um, you mentioned something about being able to measure things scientifically, and then you have the lived experience aspect of it. Um, I think there's a lot happening in psychology that's good around trying to make scientific measurements of lived experience through listening to people and getting them to kind of fill out forms and stuff like that. But I wonder, how accurately are we ever going to be able to call lived experience scientifically measured? Do you get what I'm saying?
It's a brilliant question, and it's so subjective in some ways. As I said, it's really important in the services and in the research that we acknowledge everyone's experience as being unique and personalized to them. But that creates a challenge in research itself, that how do we measure that? How do we put numbers and how do we statistically prove that kind of thing? There, just to say, I suppose in science and in psychology in general, there's no perfect measure. There's no perfect test you can unbelievably, beyond doubt, say that that's a true statement. Like even things that, especially that are have very good inter-rater reliability. So between subjects or participants, that you get consistent results. There's a lot of self-report measures. There's a lot of retrospective measures. So something I worked on was childhood trauma questionnaire, which is the CTQ, brilliant measure for childhood trauma, but it's retrospective. You're talking about stuff happened a couple of years ago. But yeah, no, to see how far we can go with that, and I think, and I hate to be bringing up co-production again, but working with the people at that level, the lived experience level, is huge. So what we're doing for the research study now that is trying to measure that subjective experience is we're going to straight away, before we even start the study, we're going to bring a advisory panel on. And actually, funny enough, what's important is the first stage of our study is called action research, and it's called participatory action research, which basically means that the people that we're going to be measuring are let's say the people that are involved in the workshops that we want to try capture their experience. Well, they're the people that are going to have a say in the very early stages of the research. So they're actually going to help design the measure that we're going to use. I think that's a huge part of it. I think that's so important going forward that that's done from the very start. And I think that'll help. As I said, there's no perfect measure in psychology, and it's a constant struggle, but we're getting there. I think we'll get as close to the truth as we possibly can, Dahi.
I like the way you said that. We'll get as close to the truth as we possibly can, and you're getting there. But yeah, I still like to accuse psychology of having white coat envy. Of thinking it's a pure science at least. But that's the aim, isn't it? That's trying to bring some order to the chaos is what this part of psychology is trying to do, so that it can be communicated to us. I really love the co-productive element of it, because that's taken the dictatorship or the ivory towerness away from um, the person who's conducting the research and the person who's bringing together all these people. And the co-producting part is like, we're in this together. This is not me telling you what you're going through. It's something more. It's let us try and figure out what's happening here. And I love the we, I love the we element of it and the us element of it. I think that's very important, and it's very important for people to understand who are worried, like I have been myself at times, that that psychology leans into the kind of command position when it comes to people's experiences, and it definitely certainly has in the past, um, kind of told us what is happening rather than helping us understand. But I like the path that you're taking, and it seems to be dealing with that rather well. You mentioned earlier that some people see words like psychosis, psychotic, schizophrenia, and they see it come up in the news, and they see it related to violent crimes and such. I think there's a bit of a selection bias there going on, of course, like, you know what I mean, because you don't hear of all the ones that have zero got to do with anything like that. But I've noticed that there is more psychologists coming into court cases in Ireland now. I'm thinking of the guard that was killed up the country by a chap who was suffering from schizophrenia, and there's other cases, and it's often both the defense and the prosecution have their own psychologists who come in and have differing views on the effect that the illness or the sickness or the condition had on the actions of the person. Um, can you speak to that? How do you think our views are changing around schizophrenia and people who commit criminal acts or people who do things wrong? What's your sense about their free will in these moments? Could you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, so I suppose it is possible that something tragic, and that is a tragic case, that could happen. But as far as we know in the literature, there is no link between having schizophrenia and being a violent person
Yeah,
on a big scale. You know, the individual cases sure can happen, but overall, there seems to be no association. But what's interesting is, I suppose, the way we kind of flip that around is that there, as a person with schizoaffective disorder or schizophrenia or psychosis, we're actually more likely to be victims of violence than we are to be violent ourselves. That's a really interesting stuff. I don't know the exact citation, but that actually
could you
seems to
repeat
be the
that,
case.
please? Could you
Sorry.
repeat that? Just could you repeat that for the listeners? I think that's a super important thing.
Yeah, so as far as the research we know of, that I think we're supposed to be victims of, or we're actually more likely to be victims of violence than to be violent ourselves,
Mm,
um, just because of the nature of the disorder, and maybe the situations that people find themselves in.
yeah.
But I don't know the exact explanation for that. I mean, I haven't read the papers or the literature on that. Maybe I should. But yeah, I know that there doesn't there definitely that violence piece does come from the media, and especially not even print media or news or that kind of mainstream media, but things like movies or books that try to not I suppose they're not directly promoting the violent aspect, but there is that sensationalist kind of thing where if I can create a character who is has psychotic features and it's very entertaining, like perhaps the Joker or something like that, the recent movie that came out. Well, that could be entertaining and that could shock people. But is there any truth in that? I don't think so. I don't think there's any link. And that is strange for people to kind of, I suppose, take it into account. It's funny, we did a workshop in school recently in a school in Roscommon, and there was a quiz question. It was like a mental health literacy question. What are features of schizophrenia? And one of them was like split personality disorder, common misconception, delusions, or violence. And I was so inspired by the young generation, and they pretty much 90% of them said delusions. I was like, how do they know this? So that just shows that the stigma is improving, or that the stigma reduction obviously is working. That even the youngest people in society kind of are starting to realize that things are improving. And it's not true, but yeah, that'd be my
How did
answer. That yeah, there's no association.
Great, 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 great. I think it's an important thing to get out there because we do live in a media environment of if it bleeds, it leads, and then we try to add on all the trigger words to make it lead even more, and a lot of the trigger words are associated with some of these conditions. How how impactful is the sense of community? When I was in that room the last night, I imagined a lot of these people were contributors, which meant a lot of these people might have had psychotic episodes or been through some of that stuff. And I looked around the room, and now I often get this feeling, but I thought, oh, they all seem like a lot saner than me, a lot better than me. So, do you know what I mean? Like, is there something about a sense of community in these people that they know that we've all suffered something similar here, rather than the
Yeah, well,
loneliness that one might get in the episode?
yeah, there's isolation there. There's the initial piece where even as a person who has experienced an episode myself, I had never heard of psychosis when I was 15. When I came out of the experience, I just wanted to forget about it. I didn't know other people really went through this. I didn't know what the rates were, how common it was. I didn't really understand it. And that can be very, very isolating for someone, a young person or anyone that experiences psychosis. And what I tried to do as a peer support worker, interesting that you mentioned the peer and the connection and the community. That obviously I have a master's in clinical neuroscience, but I tend to not talk about neuroscience on a peer support call. You know, it's not the most important thing. I could, but I don't do it. And we're taught that we're not experts by training in peer support. We're experts by experience. So when someone tells me, "Oh, I have psychosis. I've had psychosis in the past," the first thing I don't say is, "Oh, did you know that genetics plays a big role?" I just say, "Yeah, I know how you feel." I say, "I've been through that." I say, "How did you find therapy?" They might tell me how or ask me, "How did you find therapy?" And that's the peer connection. That's peer support, and that's huge. And that's not just for psychosis. There's peer support workers for depression, anxiety, anything really, eating disorders. And if you look at the research coming out now, it's in early days of the most trials, especially in Australia. Peer support seems to be really important, and we, as you said, community. Funny enough, there's a section on our website. So the most trial is carried out online. It's a digital mental health information, so it's online. There's actually a section called community. So there's a part where it's like a Facebook wall or whatever like that, where it's a private forum for people that have lived experience, and they can chat to each other, and that's really important as well. Hard to drive engagement on a platform like that. It's especially if people maybe have features of social anxiety that they mightn't want to put themselves out there. But when you see that engagement, when someone puts up a post and says, "I'm feeling a bit down today," and you'll see the comments come in, they'll say, "Oh, same here. I know how you feel." And then we do Zoom calls, which are brilliant. They bring everyone on the platform together. So we could have five, six people with lived experience in mental health, and then one or two facilitators and peer support workers. And to see that connection. And funny enough, something that I learned from that peer support experience was to facilitate them Zoom calls in the collective as well. So I think I mentioned that earlier, that we have a couple of people with quite, you know, serious psychosis experience on them calls. And the feedback we've gotten directly or indirectly from people. Maybe they won't say it explicitly that they don't know, they don't say, "Oh, the peer connection is really important," but they'll say, "Geez, it was so nice to talk about that with someone that has the same experience." They mightn't always have the language to say, lived experience movement or sharing the vision or all these policy documents. They just want to talk to someone, and that's the most basic human kind of emotion, I suppose, is that connection to other people. And it's rewarding for me as a facilitator, but it's also I learn a lot from it as a human and as a person with lived experience myself. It works both ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other side of that, I guess, is would isolation tend to trigger episodes in some people?
Possibly it's a contributing factor. I would say, yeah, social isolation,
Yeah.
social functioning or social recovery, I suppose, is a huge aspect of it. So there's a bunch of aspects of recovery. Some of it is functional. So you have your employment support, you have existential recovery, which is like, I suppose where do you see yourself in the world, your kind of self esteem. There's clinical recovery, so your measures on different scales of clinical symptoms, and then yeah, social recovery is a huge part. So reintegrating with society. So if that's important afterwards, then you can imagine how important it is before an episode as well.
Mhm.
That definitely could be
Yeah.
a factor.
Um, Do you have any advice for people who may suspect they're suffering from psychosis, who may have family members they suspect, who may be just worried that it's something that's going to come up? Do you have any advice or places people can go to find further information or help?
Yeah, so I suppose the gold standard kind of treatments or help seeking information would be things like the HSE, your GP can't recommend that enough. The GP, I suppose, depending on what age you are, it could be CAMS, it could be the EIP, which is the early intervention psychosis services in the country. They're quite quite good. The waiting lists and that kind of stuff can often be an issue, purely funding issues and resources. Never, I think it's my experience, at least with the HSE and the services, is that once you get in, it's good. You tend to you get looked after. At least that's my experience. Not everyone's experience that the care is perfect, but I think early intervention for sure is the biggest thing. I think it came up in the discussion at the launch the last night that the earlier you intervene in psychosis, so you catch it early, nip it in the bud, that improves your long term outcomes. So like, okay, you could intervene late and you could still have a great outcome, clinically, everything socially, but in general, over what we know from the data is that if you intervene early and go to your GP and seek information very quickly, your risk of relapse goes down, your every outcome basically improves. Most of them anyways. And a big part of that, and I hate to be coming back to stigma and everything like that again, because we've talked about it at length.
It's important.
Stigma reduction and I suppose understanding and challenging misconceptions has a big effect on help seeking and for people to seek help in the early days of it. If they know a bit more about it in terms of the literacy side of it, like what is psychosis, and if they also have that reduction in self stigma. So there's public stigma and there's self stigma, how you feel about yourself and your own condition. Reducing all these things and increasing information, they can help the intervention and the early intervention side of it an untold amount.
Okay, that's great. Um, okay, I have two questions that I've begun to ask all my guests now, and then you can read us out with another poem. Um, have you had an epiphany that you can tell us about that has made you see the world differently that you can't go back from? That it's like, okay, now I know this, or I've had this realization, I can never go back.
That's a brilliant question. I suppose it's slightly putting me on the spot, I guess. And
That's what it's designed to do.
yeah, it's a brilliant question. I feel slightly under pressure now, but
Take your time.
and if you want to talk about psychosis, I suppose that kind of thing, that's fine. But it's not even that. It's not even that. I think it's because when I was younger, I think science and I suppose science studying career was such an important piece to me that when I was in college, I was studying hard. I was trying to get my degree. I was trying to go on to pharmaceuticals or genetics or whatever it was, maybe possibly doing a PhD. But through therapy, I think I realized, and this was the epiphany, that you have the intellectual side of your brain and you have that prefrontal cortex that analyzes everything. But through therapy, I realized, and I had this very simple realization, was that you might understand something and you might understand your feelings. So, as a neuroscientist, I know maybe what sadness is or what happiness is on a chemical level, but you have to feel it as well. So, you have to be able to feel it. So, I might go throughout my day and I might say, okay, I know what sadness is, I know what pain is, I know what all these emotions are. I think it's important to sometimes experience them firsthand and be aware of your emotions. That's an epiphany in itself because okay, everything has its place. Medication, CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, understanding your thoughts, your behaviors, your emotions. But I think there is merit in being aware of your emotions. So maybe it's a bit confusing. Maybe I'm not explaining it in the right
No,
way.
no, not to me at all. The intellectual knowing there and the knowing as a neuroscientist to me sounds like um, the biological features that correlate with the experience of sadness, but knowing the experience of sadness or happiness, it's a different thing. Hmm. No, that's great. No, that's thanks for that. And the second of these questions that I hope to ask everybody who comes on here is, if we were writing a new story about what it is to be human in this world, because as throughout history this has changed, and we've got so much knowledge now about the world. So if we're writing a blank page, let's start again. Let's write with what we know now, what it is to be human in relation to each other, in relation to the rest of nature, in relation to future generations, past generations. And you were asked for one sentence to put into this story. What would that sentence be?
It's a good question, actually. So, I'll just give a bit of a preamble, but human civilization changes a lot. It changes slowly in some ways and changes quickly in others. One thing I would say as a kind of person hopes to make change and positive impact on society, and that's something one of my values is maybe. And if you want one sentence, I'm guessing.
One sentence.
It's kind of a sentence that's been used before, but I'd say just because that's the way things have always been done doesn't mean that's the way it has to be always done or done in the future. Does
Love
that
it.
make sense?
That absolutely makes sense to me. It's great. Yeah, I think it's a great sentence to throw into the next story. Okay, Conor, thanks for coming on here. It's been an absolute pleasure. I think what you're doing is wonderful, and I think you're a wonderful young man yourself. Watching you speak the last day at the launch, I thought you held the stage so well. I think you're a great champion for what you've chosen to do. And thanks very much. And good luck to everybody in the Psychosis Arts Collective. So, with that, is there anything else you'd like to say? Any other advice you'd like to give that I'm missing?
No, no.
No?
Thanks very much for having me, Dahi, and thanks for your kind words and for your bringing me on in the first place and promoting positive change. No, I think that's pretty much it. And I suppose as we kind of discussed beforehand, we might end or start and end with a poem. So I'll choose my next one now, and I'll whip it out here.
Okay. 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 Thanks, folks. Please like, share, and subscribe. And that's for my benefit. But please, if you know anybody that might benefit from listening to Conor's wisdom here, please don't be afraid to share it. And let's try and take the stigma down of mental health issues. It's important. And with that, we'll give you Conor with his final poem.
Thanks very much. So the next one is called Good Art. So I'll start now. Good art. It should shake you up like a violent storm, open up old memories like stented arteries full of culturally normed plaque you'll see. From the moment of birth you were told to colour within the lines, fit everyone's perception and realign. You dreamed of more and never settled. So today you paint and write, you fight, turn against society's tide and find the light. You create something that wouldn't exist. Only for you had your demons slain, using nothing but your mind, your brain. It is a sacrifice so noble and true to stroke a brush against the walls of the plausible, to work on the imagined, chisel at the impossible. We graft and cater for those in the crowd, for those who choose to talk instead, and critique our works for which we've bled. But we listen, we know that art is for the brave.
Brilliant.